Hi, this is Miss Worlds, and I'm here with another podcast for you. Our topic today is cells. We're going to be learning about Georgia Performance Standard SB1A. That's a high school biology standard. Students at the end of this lesson should be able to explain the role of cell organelles in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, including the cell membrane, in maintaining homeostasis and cell reproduction. Our lesson today primarily deals with the role of the cell organelles. We're going to talk about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and touch just a little bit on the function of the organelles, but the part about the homeostasis and cell reproduction will come in later lessons. We're going to start off talking about the cell theory. There are three parts to the cell theory that basically tell you the basic tenets of what you need to know about cells. First, all organisms are made of one or more cells. Organisms, if you recall from previous lessons, are living things, and every single living thing has cells. So if it doesn't have cells, it is not an organism. The second part states that the cell is the basic unit of all living things. Cells are the smallest part of any organism that are able to exist on their own. Lastly, all cells come from existing cells. Here I have a little video to kind of show you how we're going to start off with one cell, and that cell actually splits to become two cells. We'll learn more about the details later when we talk about the cell cycle, but I just wanted to kind of give you a visual. So take a look. This is kind of the end. It's a very, very short video. It's only 10 seconds. But what happened with the video here is that the scientists recorded it every minute for 50 minutes. So the process takes almost an hour for the cell to divide. Here you see the actual division that's going on. I'm just going to keep replaying it here. But that's one cell. The DNA is separating, and you'll start to see where it starts to pinch in just a little bit there, and then that cell splits into two. And then those two cells can continue to go through the process to make more and more cells. But again, we'll touch on that later in our cell cycle lesson. Now, when you think about cells, there's a couple things that you need to remember. First, there are some things that you are going to find in every single cell. Doesn't matter if it's a cell that's in a human being, a cell that's in a cow, or a cell that's a bacterial cell. All cells have a cell membrane, cytoplasm, organelles, and genetic material. Now, the cell membrane is the part that surrounds the cell. The cytoplasm is like the liquid inside. I kind of like to compare cells to a water balloon. So if you think of the balloon itself, that kind of represents the cell membrane. The cytoplasm is the liquid inside, so the water that's inside the water balloon. Now, when you start talking about organelles, imagine that you take that water balloon and you start dropping things inside. You drop a marble, you drop a rock, you drop a paper clip, and all of those things float within the liquid. That's kind of how the organelles are. But we'll learn more about what the organelles do later on. And lastly, all cells have genetic material. Another name for genetic material is DNA. Now, to start off, we've got to know about the different types of cells. There are two types of cells known to man. You have prokaryotic cells and you have eukaryotic cells. And what I've done here is kind of showing you the differences between those types of cells. First, you think about the nucleus. The nucleus is not found in prokaryotic cells, but it is found in eukaryotic cells. Your prokaryotic cells are always going to be a part of unicellular organism. Uni meaning one. So an organism that is only made of one cell is going to be prokaryotic. Most of your eukaryotic organisms will be multicellular. Then when we talked about those organelles earlier, some organelles have a membrane around them. Any organelle with a membrane around it will only be found in a eukaryotic cell, not in prokaryotic. And then when we talk about the different types of organisms with these cells, the only cells in the whole wide world that have prokaryotic cells are bacteria. Examples of eukaryotic organisms are plants and animals. And essentially, anything that's not a bacteria is eukaryotic. Bacteria and bacteria alone are prokaryotic. So this picture shows you a typical prokaryotic cell. Notice the word typical. Not all prokaryotic cells look like this, but it gives you a general idea of what you'll find. Notice when you look around here, you see the cell membrane. Here they call it the plasma membrane. But cell membrane, plasma membrane, that's the same thing. You see the DNA here in the middle. You see the cytoplasm, that's the green part here. And then I told you all that all cells have organelles. The organelles that are in this cell are ribosomes. Ribosomes are a unique type of organelle because they do not have membranes around them. So that's why we see ribosomes inside the prokaryotic cell. Now here you can see a big difference. With the eukaryotic cell, you still see the cell membrane. That's the part here that surrounds the cell. You have your cytoplasm. That's the liquid that you see all of these little organelles floating around in. The DNA lives inside of the nucleus of the cell, so it's a little difficult to see here, but just know that the DNA is always inside of the nucleus. And then you have organelles. Now, if you look here, you see the eukaryotic cell is a lot more complex than a prokaryotic cell. You have lots of different types of organelles here. They're labeled lysosomes, Golgi complex, the endoplasmic reticulum. There are even ribosomes in the eukaryotic cell, just like there were in the prokaryotic cell. But remember, ribosomes do not have membranes around them. You have mitochondrion, all of these different organelles in the eukaryotic cell will later learn have different jobs that they have to do. And if they don't do their jobs, then the cell itself will not be able to work. So here's a little Venn diagram just for comparison. I know I'm a visual type person. I like to see differences and similarities, and this is a good thing to do. They always use a Venn diagram. So prokaryotes, all your bacteria, they do not have membranes around their organelles. All prokaryotes are unicellular. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, can be all of the other organisms that aren't bacteria. They do have a nucleus. They do have membrane-bound organelles. The similarities, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane. They have DNA and they have cytoplasm. Now, a lot of times people confuse or don't understand that when we say eukaryotic cells, both plant cells and animal cells are eukaryotic. The structure of the plant cell and animal cell is different because plant cells and animal cells have different functions. So an important thing to remember about cells is that their structure is directly related to their function or the job that they have to do. So let's take a look. Here, if you take a look, the typical animal cell that I showed you earlier in the podcast was an animal cell. Over here, this is what a typical plant cell, and you can visually see some of the differences here. A lot of the organelles are the same. You'll see the nucleus, you'll see the mitochondrion, the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosomes are found in both the plant cell and the animal cell. But a couple of things that you will see in a plant cell that you will not see in the animal cell. The first thing I want to talk about is the cell wall. Notice here that the cell wall actually is outside of the cell membrane. Here's your cell membrane, but then you have another layer here, the cell wall. Now what the cell wall does is it provides kind of like a stiff structure around the plant cell. And think about it. You have big, tall trees outside. If there were no cell wall, there wouldn't be that additional structure, and every time the wind blew, those trees would just flop over. But the cell wall kind of makes the plant cells stack up against each other like bricks, so it's very, very rigid. Now back to my water balloon analogy. If you imagine taking that water balloon that we talked about a little earlier and you place it inside of a shoebox, the shoebox then compares to the cell wall because the shoebox doesn't have that flexibility. It's very stiff and rigid, and you can stack them on one another. Another thing that's found in a plant cell that's not in an animal cell are chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are the green organelles that you see scattered throughout. The purpose of the chloroplast is to do photosynthesis. The reason that you're not going to have a chloroplast in the animal cell is, and I'm sure you've probably guessed this already, Animal cells do not do photosynthesis, so there's no need for a chloroplast. I didn't mention it down here in the notes section. However, you might notice this big, huge bubble. The big, huge bubble is actually called a large central vacuole. Now, there are vacuoles in the animal cells, but nothing as prominent as the large central vacuole in a plant cell. The purpose of this central vacuole is to store water. And we all know that plants need water in order to live. The last thing we're going to touch on in this podcast is to just give you an overview of the organelles within a cell. Now, these organelles each have different jobs that they have to do within a cell. And the job ensures that the cell can function properly and can keep the organism alive, because all of the cells in a living being help that organism stay alive, and all the organelles within the cell work together to help the organism stay alive. This is just a brief overview of some of the organelles that you'll find in a cell, and it goes over some of the functions that the organelles have. So the nucleus is the control center of the cell. It has the DNA. Ribosomes make the proteins in the cell. The endoplasmic reticulum is responsible for transportation. The mitochondrion makes ATP, or energy. The chloroplast is used to make photosynthesis occur. The Golgi complex is for packaging. The central vacuole stores water. And then the lysosome gets rid of waste products. In our next podcast, we're going to look at how these different jobs that the organelles do in the cell are similar to the jobs that the workers have in a factory. So it'll be a neat little analogy that we look at. I'm excited to be heading in that direction. I hope you are too. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you at the next podcast.